Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 2020 Hot Topics Environmental Law Summer Lecture Series, brought to you by the Environmental Law Center here at Vermont Law School. I'm Jenny Rushlow, Director of the Environmental Law Center and Associate Dean for Environmental Programs. I'm going to bring up a list of resources onto the screen to direct you to some of the programs we have at the Environmental Law Center. We are pleased to welcome two speakers, Brian Potts and Andrew Hanson. Brian Potts is a partner in Perkins Coie LLP Environmental and Energy Regulatory Group. Brian and his team have appeared in more than 50 administrative proceedings and dozens of federal and state court cases. And he's been involved in billions of dollars worth of business transactions and has helped his clients obtain regulatory approvals to build more than $4 billion worth of utility infrastructure in various states, including conventional power plants, transmission lines, wind farms, and solar facilities. Andrew Hanson is Senior Counsel at Perkins Coie LLP's Environmental and Energy Regulatory Group, where he has been involved in negotiating contracts and seeking regulatory approvals for hundreds of millions of dollars of investments in renewable energy projects, energy efficiency, and demand response programs, electric vehicle infrastructure, advanced metering infrastructure, grid modernization, and other emerging technologies in the energy sector. Andrew has negotiated contracts for the acquisition of several hundred megawatts of wind and solar projects and securing regulatory approval for 1,000 megawatts of new wind generation. Prior to joining Perkins Coie, Andrew spent 7 years as a trial attorney with the DOJ Environment and Natural Resources Division, and prior to that at the EPA and its Office of Civil Enforcement and Office of Groundwater and Drinking Water. Brian and Andrew are co-instructors for a summer course this year at BLS called Renewable Energy Project Finance and Development. And today their talk is titled Debating the Merits of Alternative Transportation Fuels. Please join me in welcoming Brian Potts and Andrew Hanson.
Thanks, Jenny. I'm going to sort of go first and kick off here, but Andrew will be generally covering and debating with me the merits of sort of electric vehicles. And I have a lot of background in renewable fuels. So I'm going to start with sort of a bit about renewable fuels, and then we can debate renewable fuels versus EVs. And hopefully we're hoping this will be a conversation. So definitely feel free to chime in, submit your questions, and we will try to answer them. And if there aren't enough questions, Andrew and I can argue with each other. We have lots of practice doing that. As Jenny said, my name is Brian Potts. I actually was a law student at Vermont Law School. I graduated in 2004. And since then, I've spent over 10 years practicing environmental and energy law in Madison, Wisconsin. Why does that matter? Well, Madison, when I got to Madison in 2006, ethanol production was booming. It was the industry that everybody wanted to be invested in. Farmers were making money hand over fist. Investors were throwing money at the ethanol industry. Corn farmers who either supplied the plants or invested in them were getting rich. And this is not an understatement. Everything was ethanol when I first came to Wisconsin in 2006. So I did a lot of work permitting ethanol plants, getting them built, financed, etc. And so what was driving the boom? Well, in 2005, Congress had passed what's called the Energy Policy Act of of 2005, and I'll get to the details of what the act did in a minute, but I want to give a little background on why Congress passed this law in 2005. So first, in the early 2000s, and actually while I was at VLS, and then I got a master's degree shortly after, and the professors and everybody was saying that ethanol and biodiesel have significant greenhouse gas reductions. And so there was a lot of analysis done, and compared to gasoline and diesel, the conclusion initially was, and I say initially, foreshadowing, that ethanol had great greenhouse gas reduction benefits compared to gasoline. So, that was one of the driving factors. There was also, we were in a situation, this was pre-fracking, when the country was trying to wean itself off of foreign oil, and ethanol and biodiesel could be made in the US. And sort of third, ethanol and biodiesel use soybeans and corn, which both have, farm industry, which are part of the farm industry that had huge political power in Washington. So Congress created this program. They called it the Renewable Fuel Program that required oil refiners to blend a certain amount of these renewable fuels into their gasoline and diesel fuel. And the statute itself, which is actually part of the Clean Air Act, it was an amendment to the Clean Air Act, it ratchets up the percentages over time that these refiners have to blend in. So if you're an oil refiner, say, Marathon Oil, and you're running a refinery, you have an obligation, and they're called obligated parties for that reason, to make sure that a certain amount of renewable fuels are, quote unquote, blended into the fuel that you have finished refining and put on the market into the pipelines or sold it. So it's similar to the way I like to explain it. A lot of people aren't familiar with this program unless it's something you're specifically working on or have a client in. But it's similar to renewable portfolio standards for wind and solar and other renewable technologies, which a lot of people are familiar with. So essentially, some percentage of the overall renewable fuel that goes into the market is required to have to be renewable. So from a high level, the RPS and the Renewable Fuel Program are sort of similar. Well, Congress passed this law, ethanol is booming, everything's going great, and then something happened. The science changed. Many of the original studies that showed that the greenhouse gas benefits of ethanol were critiqued. And scientists started agreeing that, at least for ethanol, and in particular, ethanol made by using natural gas or even coal, there were some ethanol plants that were burning coal to make ethanol. The benefits were negligible compared to gasoline, if there were benefits at all. So for that reason and a few others, Congress revised the statutes in 2007, and then EPA revised the rules. And effectively what they did was put a cap on ethanol created from using natural gas or processes that don't have as good of a greenhouse gas reduction. And then in conjunction with that 2007 Act and then EPA's rules, they created incentives, even more incentives for sort of what I'll call more climate-friendly renewable fuels like biodiesel, ethanol made from switchgrass, and things like other than corn. So this all happened, again, between 2005 and 2008 or 9. And the way the program works, essentially, what has happened here is Congress and then EPA, through implementing the program, has created this system of credits. So they trade credits. The credits are called RINs, which is an acronym for Renewable Identification Numbers. So every gallon of ethanol that is produced or biodiesel gets assigned a renewable identification number, or a RIN. It's literally a number. That RIN then follows the fuel. It can't be separated and sold from the fuel until the fuel is blended into gasoline. So you produce ethanol, the ethanol producer has these RINs, but the ethanol producer, unless they blended in their ethanol directly into gasoline, can't separate the RIN and sell it to an oil refiner. They essentially have to go through the process of the RIN stays with the fuel all the way down through the process until the ethanol is ultimately blended in to the gasoline that's been put in the pipeline and sold to consumers. So that was the idea. The thought, I think, at the time was that the blend point would occur at the refinery. And so, the refiners who, have these big refineries would buy the ethanol, blend it in, put it into the pipeline. They'd then have the RINs, and EPA essentially set requirements because the refiners, if they produce 100, and I'll make these numbers up just for simplicity, the refiner wants to produce 100 gallons of gasoline, and it needs 10% renewable fuel. It needs 10 RINs, 10 gallons, to sell that 100 gallons of gasoline. So the refiners have a certain renewable fuel obligation. They have to have a certain number of RINs. So that all sounds great. The problem with that in practice is, the amount of money involved is exorbitant. So you're talking about every gallon of gasoline and diesel sold in the U.S. Has a renewable obligation associated now, and so that the RINs became pretty valuable. And the issue is when you separate the RIN and isn't always at the refinery. And so EPA created this program, and it just happened that some companies owned, for example, gas stations and decided to do the blending at the gas station, or they owned the gate where the fuel was sold and they decided to do the blending at the gate. And so all of a sudden, the refiners who have this obligation didn't have anywhere near enough RIN and were beholden to the few big companies, one of whom is actually Marathon, who own downstream facilities that could separate these RINs and get them. So that created one big problem, and it's still playing out now. There's essentially fights between the oil companies and the small oil refineries and the big oil refineries and the fully integrated ones over the separation point and where it should be and how this should work, because effectively what was happening and is still happening today is hundreds of millions of dollars would get put on a small refiner that maybe has no way to get RINs, and they would essentially be paying a big oil refiner that $100 million to get the RINs that they just happen to have because they own the gate where the blending occurs. So this created one big set of problems that I'll talk about. And then the other thing that was sort of interesting when the program was created is a few people, and I'm not going to say a lot, but not an insignificant amount, just faked it. So they said they were producing renewable fuels. They went out and sold the RINs and associated with the renewable fuel, and they never actually created any renewable fuel. And EPA caught them. And so then you had this whole situation where the obligated parties had just bought these RINs from Company A, but Company A never actually made any renewable fuel. Company A's CEO goes to jail because it's fraud. And so now obligated party says, well, wait a minute, I bought these. And EPA says, no, you didn't actually get real RINs. And so there's been a lot. The long story short is this has been an interesting, it's great for lawyers, and it's been an interesting program because EPA has essentially created a market. And like a lot of complicated markets, it's imperfect and has been gamed. So it has increased the amount of renewable fuel, but it has also created all these weird issues, including, the fact that the statute now requires a certain amount of renewable fuel that literally isn't made. there's not even enough renewable fuel of certain type to even meet the statutory requirement today. So it's a bit of a mess, and Congress obviously isn't good at passing laws and fixing things. So we're set here in this situation where it's a really interesting, strange, complicated market that is promoting ethanol, which is marginally, most cases, it has no climate benefit. And then biodiesel and switchgrass ethanol and other things that we just literally can't make enough of because the technology hasn't caught up to where they thought it would. So that's a very quick primer, and I'll turn it over to Andrew to talk about EVs, and then we can get in the weeds a little bit more.
Yeah, that sounds great. And what you're not going to hear from me is a pro-ethanol presentation. This is not where the debate really kind of begins between Brian and I, to the extent that there's a debate at all. And also what you're not going to hear from me, though, is, well, obviously gas-powered cars and gasoline is the fuel of the future, and we should just stick with that because ethanol has been kind of a failure. There's obviously a better way to do it. One thing that I kind of want to dovetail into Brian's discussion about like the rise of ethanol in the US around that time frame, there's this other thing that kind of flowed out of the Energy Policy Act of 2005, which was the Department of Energy Alternative Fuel Vehicle Program, which in a nutshell covers large fleets or owners of large fleets of vehicles in the country, which by the way includes electric utilities. And likewise, it includes like states. States have, and municipalities typically have large fleets of vehicles. And typically like a covered fleet is anyone with, excuse me for a second, is anyone with 20 or more light duty vehicles that are centrally fueled or capable of being centrally fueled and used primarily within a metropolitan area with a 1980 census population of more than 250,000, or 50 or more light-duty vehicles in the U.S. And a light-duty vehicle, by the way, is a vehicle that's less than 8,500 pounds. And so if you are an owner of a fleet and you have a lot of light-duty vehicles or within these thresholds, you need to comply with the Alternative Fuel Vehicle Program, which again came about in like the really like in the mid-2000s. Out of the Energy Policy Act, and there's a requirement. There's a core requirement. It's an acquisition requirement that every time you buy new vehicles and add them to your fleet, you're required to meet the alternative fuel vehicle annual acquisition requirement of 90%, meaning 90% of your acquisitions need to be in alternative fuel vehicles. And so the question becomes, what is an alternative fuel vehicle? Right. Well, back around this time when ethanol was really getting ramped up, one of the definitions of alternative fuel vehicles is a vehicle that relies on ethanol or like an E85 type of vehicle. Like this program was kind of built around this idea that ethanol was going to be a fuel of the future. And it kind of gradually evolved as well, you know, so that fleet owners could acquire lots of different alternative fuel vehicles, but one obvious choice was going to be ethanol, supplying your vehicles with ethanol. Well, the world has changed quite a bit since the early 2000s. And in fact, electric transportation electrification is actually kind of taken over, not taken over, but is emerging as a source of alternative transportation and alternative fuels. And one issue is whether or not the alternative fuels program that the Department of Energy has created can be more closely adapted and aligned to that emerging trend and away from relying on ethanol as a source of alternative fuel and ethanol-based vehicles like E85 vehicles as within the definition or a part of the alternative fuel vehicle definition in the program. And there are a couple of aspects of the alternative fuel vehicle program that I think are kind of interesting because it's a bit of a malleable program, right? It came out of and was created in the mid-2000s before electric vehicles had really started to take off, and as ethanol was kind of emerging. But at the same time, there was a certain prescience to the program too, where you can actually meet the acquisition mandate, 90%, the 90% requirement if you're a large fleet owner like a utility or a state or a municipality, by acquiring electric vehicles. And in fact, you can acquire credits by buying extra electric vehicles, so that for the next year, when you have to buy vehicles, you can use the EVs that you bought early on to offset the acquisition requirement. And the other interesting kind of thing about the program is that you can acquire credits by building electric vehicle infrastructure, and you earn by spending about $25,000 per credit. And there's a pretty kind of detailed table and chart that describes how that works. But the important thing is you spend $25,000 on electric vehicle infrastructure, which, by the way, is about the cost of a DC fast charging station. You can earn up to 10 credits or spend up to $250,000 on EV infrastructure under this program. And so I'm raising this program because it was created kind of with, I would say, largely one purpose in mind, and is evolving and adapting to the emerging trend in electric vehicles to actually allow and foster and promote electric vehicles as well, by allowing these fleet owners to invest in infrastructure and to acquire EVs as a way of meeting this acquisition mandate requirement. And so that's like one tool. And just as an aside, I've been interested in electric vehicles for a little while now, and the way you kind of promote and foster electric vehicles and maybe move away from gas-powered vehicles, because as we all know, probably if you're listening in on the discussion, or maybe you're just interested in this, you would know that electric vehicles, if you're purely electric, you have zero emissions. Even if you're a plug-in hybrid vehicle, you have much lower emissions than a purely gas-powered vehicle, and you have lower life cycle emissions as well, and in terms of like the manufacturing and creation of the vehicle. And so they're attractive from an air quality perspective on a number of levels. And I've been interested in figuring out, there's been a lot of focus, and we'll talk for a few minutes on new and creative ways to promote electric vehicles. But one reason why I wanted to mention the alternative fuels program was partly to dovetail off of what Brian was talking about with the renewable fuels mandate, but also to talk about what are the existing things that we have in place that can be adapted and used to actually create more opportunities and spur investment in electric vehicles and electric vehicle infrastructure. And I think the alternative fuels program is one way to do that. Like I said at the beginning of what I was saying, of my little portion of the talk here, was the answer is, apparently not ethanol. Brian and I are not going to debate that aspect. But the answer also, I think, is not just reverting back to gas-powered cars because ethanol didn't work. Instead, I think there are lots of opportunities to promote electric vehicles throughout the country. And if I could just indulge the group for a little bit longer, I just want to step through kind of what's happening in the electric vehicle space and how electric vehicles are growing, and what are the, I would say, legal issues, barriers, and for no pun intended, I swear, drivers for electric vehicle adoption. And so it's happening in a couple of different spaces. I already mentioned the alternative fuels program by DOE. That's one. The other one is just utilities. And utility regulators are really starting to move into this space. Utilities are, I think it's fair to say, inherently and understandably cautious about new technology and investing in new technology, especially when it comes to using ratepayer funds. Regulators are likewise skeptical and cautious about investing. However, there are a lot of utilities around the country, many utilities in fact, who are developing programs around fostering or promoting electric vehicles. And in fact, it's hard to think of utilities in the country, any utilities that aren't doing this right now. There are incentive programs, utility funded and regulator approved programs for incentivizing EV infrastructure and deployment and EV ownership. There are also state-funded incentive programs. I know that Vermont has a state-funded incentive program that I think came about in 2019 to promote and foster EV ownership. And if you go to Vermont's webpage, they've got like all the models that are eligible for the Vermont incentive. And I mean, the selection looks pretty good. And we could, if anybody wants to like talk later, we could talk about all the cool models that are available. But Vermont is not alone. There are lots of states that are doing this. There are a couple of regulatory issues that a lot of states have had to grapple with, like making sure that third-party ownership of EV infrastructure is not a public utility. About half the states in the country have clarified that issue so that you don't have this disincentive or barrier to third parties moving into the state and building EV infrastructure. And utilities are starting to explore the concept of owning their own charging infrastructure around the country. That's a little bit slower because I think a lot of the trend is that most regulatory commissions would prefer that utilities didn't own it and use ratepayer funds to pay for it, but that instead third-party companies would own it. And that avoids the risk of stranded assets where a utility plops down a bunch of DC fast charging stations, which charge your car really quickly, but they don't get enough usage and utilization is a little bit too low. Having third parties invest in those is with maybe some modest utility incentive, funding incentive, I think is a safe, most commissions and regulatory commissions have thought is a safer bet. One other thing that utilities are doing, though, to kind of foster and promote EV infrastructure, and this is kind of in their own interest, is one, I mean, apart from the fact that you get load growth, which utilities are always looking for, they're also looking at ways to leverage electric vehicles as a source of, or as a way to manage system costs so that you have demand on the system or additional demand on the system when demand is lowest, meaning you want people to charge at night, and you can do that through time of use rates or special charging rates for EV owners. Or you can do it through utility managed charging programs where you allow the utility the ability to charge your vehicle and at what rate, like what time of day and at what rate. And there are lots of managed charging pilot programs that are either being applied for by utilities around the country or a few that have been approved to see whether it works, whether a utility's ability to manage the rate at which your vehicle is charging can actually reduce system costs and save all ratepayers some money in addition to the load growth that you get from it. And then there's technology that's being tested in a pilot basis around the country with vehicle-to-grid technologies, which usually is being done with large fleets like school buses, where the utility can essentially draw on the batteries in those school buses as a source of capacity during periods of high demand, and then allow the buses to charge during periods of lower demand. So there's lots of things going on in the utility space.
I was going to ask before you move on. I mean, sorry, I think you might have to go on mute while I'm talking.
Oh, sorry.
The question I had for you was: are electric vehicles the savior for utilities? Because it certainly doesn't. I mean, just ballpark back of the estimate, back of the envelope. I mean, even if a lot of people started driving electric vehicles, that's going to help load growth. But I mean, how much do you think it'll help?
Yeah, I mean, sorry, folks. This is probably another area where Brian and I aren't going to have a ton of strong disagreement. I would say that load growth is the savior for utilities, but I don't know that electric vehicles are ever going to provide enough load growth without dramatically higher adoption rates for electric vehicles in the U.S. And not just residential ownership, but like large fleets would need to turn over. Like having like an Amazon distribution, several Amazon distribution centers all operating with trucks that all operate on electric might move the needle a little bit or somewhat significantly, but not more than like, I hesitate to say anything because this is being recorded, but I would be surprised if it were more than several percent.
Okay, yeah, and I mean, the other sort of question I had is California has a lot of sort of like its own RPS, or I mean, renewable fuel standard, and that's been driving a lot of sort of natural gas usage, renewable natural gas usage in these fleet vehicles. I mean, isn't that better from a climate perspective than electric vehicles? I mean, I guess my view on electric vehicles is they're great unless you live like we do in Wisconsin, where they're generating a lot of energy from coal. You're on mute, Andrew.
Yeah. That's like a data-driven, and there's a data-driven answer to that question, right? But on the whole, and this is just maybe an opinion, but I think electric vehicles, even those powered by coal-fired generation, will have a lower carbon impact than whatever it was that you were just talking about. Just because the mileage rate on those vehicles is so much better, that I would like. This is like a controversial thing to say, but I would take probably an electric vehicle powered in a state that is powered, like half of which of the generation is powered by coal, over like whatever the renewable mandate was that you were talking about in California. I have to think that that's a bit better. But again, there's a data-driven answer to that particular question. Because you're ultimately helping the utility, especially if you have aggressive managed charging programs, you're helping the utility manage that load and overall and lower system costs as well. And it also helps the utility and fosters the utility's ability to rely on renewable sources of generation, which are inherently variable. So you're tying the charging of your electric vehicle to the timing of when variable generation is happening, like wind late at night.
Okay, but why should other utility ratepayers subsidize electric infrastructure that they're not using? You knew I was going to ask that question.
Yeah. I don't know that I think that they should necessarily. It depends. Like, that's the point of these pilot programs, right? Does a managed charging program actually reduce system costs such that all ratepayers benefit? And if the answer to that question is yes, then I would answer your question yes. If utility customers are going to benefit from that managed charging program, then yeah, they should pitch in for an incentive program funded by the utility. The same thing with the increase in load from the addition of electric vehicles on the grid, right? Where the utility is adding load. Utility customers benefit from that under a traditional utility cost model because there's more load and more sales over which to spread the benefits to utility customers. So again, that's like a really basic cost benefit analysis that a lot of states are doing, including North Carolina and South Carolina. I don't think it's as a matter of principle that utility customers should always subsidize or pay for. I hate the word, I'm not using the word subsidize, but help pay for EV infrastructure. What needs to happen is a valid, robust cost-benefit analysis that's grounded in the program that the utility is actually promoting, rather than like a generalized cost-benefit, something specific. And if you can show that, then that all customers would benefit, then that's a good program. It may not be true in every case.
Yeah, and let me just chime in on I threw you the renewable natural gas question, and I wanted to point out one other thing that you had mentioned a lot of these state incentive programs for EVs, and just I'd like to note that a lot of those, and I don't know that Vermont's is one of them, but a lot of them stem from the Volkswagen emission scandal settlements. Yeah. And the other companies that were involved in that, they had to essentially put a ton of money up, and it's been divvied up in a lot of cases among the states, which have helped to pay for those programs. It's also why you'll see like VW, for example, is I think you and I were talking about this the other day, but they're switching one of their facilities to be just EVs, and they're trying to get a lot of like, oh, look at us, we're doing great things. And really, I bet if you go look at the settlements that they had to sign, they had to do that. So I always think I take those sort of incentives. I mean, they're great if you're buying an electric car. You should absolutely use them. But from a sort of big picture policy perspective, they're not always what you think they are. The other thing is on the renewable. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was going to say, and this is maybe the controversial thing to say at this point in the presentation, but the Volkswagen settlement is a lot of money. But if you look at the way the money is being spent across multiple jurisdictions, it's not like, people are probably going to need a lot of people raising their hands. I don't get the sense that it's really significantly moving the needle on electric vehicle adoption. Like if you go and look at the way the money's being spent on a state by state basis, a couple of transit buses in one city are being replaced. A couple of school buses in some other cities are being replaced. But it's not like wholesale structural change here. You're just kind of getting a few more, electric buses, transit buses or school buses, and maybe a little bit more on the EV infrastructure deployment. But I just don't, and maybe somebody's going to challenge me and tell me I'm flatly wrong on this, but I just don't see the Volkswagen settlement money really moving the needle that much on electric vehicles. The thing that seems to be moving the needle, to the extent it's moving the needle at all, and I'm also not super rosy about it, is like state incentive programs and the federal tax credit. That has spurred electric vehicle adoption, which has in turn spurred demands for more infrastructure from the people who are driving those vehicles. But go ahead, Brian, I kind of cut you off.
Yeah, no, I think we actually agree a lot on that. I mean, I think electric vehicles are here. They're here to stay. I don't think 90% of the population is going to be driving electric vehicles in 5 years, but I do think they will make up a substantial portion in the 2030 timeframe. The other thing I wanted to point out is I think on when I mentioned renewable natural gas earlier, there are incentives now in California. When you take the California renewable fuel credit and add it to the EPA renewable credits I've talked about, basically what's happening is people are paying effectively $80 or more for natural gas that's renewable to put in fleet vehicles because of these renewable credits. So I do think there is a lot of growth in the renewable natural gas for fleet vehicle area that is almost entirely tied to California's low carbon emission standard and the EPA renewable fuel standards. So I would expect to see some significant growth in that area, but I don't think regular folks like you or I are ever going to be driving around with natural gas cars. I think that's a pretty narrow subset.
I mean, you see
of the fleet.
You see them in state fleets, right? And partly, I think,
like
to meet the acquisition mandate that a lot of states are subject to under the All Fuels program. Like, you can buy natural gas vehicles, but I don't have any friends. I don't have any friends that are driving around natural gas vehicles, and you just don't see them on the road. So yeah, I kind of share your skepticism on that as well. I think that the thing that I want to be realistic about, maybe along the lines of what Brian is saying, is that until there's some sort of disruptive change or program that really represents a national shift toward electric vehicles, it's just not, the adoption rate is not going to happen very quickly. It's going to happen gradually, right? It'll happen as battery costs decline, technology improves, consumers just become more aware of the joys of driving electric vehicles. And so at some point there will be a tipping point. But if I'm being realistic and maybe a little bit skeptical about it, I think that tipping point is a little bit ways off yet, until battery costs go down, vehicle ranges go up, and you just start to see more of these vehicles on the road, such that people begin to notice them more and more. Absent that, if Congress adopted a really aggressive federal tax credit for people to buy electric vehicles and for large fleet owners to change over their fleets, I mean, that is the sort of thing that would create, like the production tax credits or the investment tax credit for renewable energy, that would spur a boom, that would spur a transition. Until then, maybe the controversial thing that I would say is we're kind of nibbling around the edges a little bit of this sector.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue we should scrap the renewable fuel program and put that money towards electric vehicles. But that's Brian Potts speaking, not Perkins Coie. So I know I think it's 11:45 and we're supposed to take questions. So I don't know if there are any questions yet, Jenny.
There have to be after what we did.
Jenny says yes.
Yeah. Hi, yes, there are questions. So thank you. That's been really interesting and great to hear your back and forth. So let's jump into the questions here. The first one is, in the context of EV emissions, can you address tailpipe emissions versus fuel emissions? How does the utilities fuel mix factor into the debate between EVs and biofuels?
I think that if I understood the question right, it's tailpipe emissions versus the utilities emissions. Was that the question?
That was my understanding.
Yeah, tailpipe emissions versus fuel emissions.
I mean, it's a little bit. Yeah, I mean, the first part of that question, it requires a technical analysis, and I think I'm sure that there have been studies that have been done that evaluate whether or not the increase in emissions from, for example, a coal-fired power plant, as Brian had mentioned, offsets whatever benefits you're getting from the increased use of and driving of EVs. But my sense, and people can disagree with me and tell me I'm flatly wrong, is that EVs, even powered by coal-fired generation, have lower overall life cycle emissions than gas-powered cars. I think that's EPA's conclusion.
Yeah, and I can weigh in a little bit on that if you want.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, please.
So, yeah, I mean, I know that there are calculators online where you can go and you can put in, I live here, say, and I did this once. I was thinking of getting an electric vehicle and I had a Prius, and I put them in and basically it said they were the same. This was in Wisconsin like 5 or 8 years ago when we had a lot more coal. But so that gives you an example. Like Wisconsin, for example, is one of the has a higher proportion of coal power, so it's quote unquote dirtier. And even 6-7 years ago, an electric car still was as good as a Prius, and any other car, and the Prius was one of the best from an emission standpoint. So I think most cases an electric vehicle is going to be better from an emission standpoint than a gas-fired, like you said. I mean, there may be weird anomalies.
And to be clear, that was like 6 or 7 years ago, and the technology has gone through like multiple revolutions since then, such that I think the conclusion is that overall, if you buy an EV, even in a state that maybe has a higher proportion of not fossil generation, that EV is going to do better on an emissions perspective than a gas-powered car. Overall, but Brian's right. You can go and look at your specific, like where you live, and do the calculator.
Last I looked, the Union of Concerned Scientists had a map and some helpful resources to give you an overview of how the fuel mix relates to this. So if folks are looking to get more information on that, you might check out the website for UCS. Next question. Because no transportation fuel is zero emitting, what do you two believe is the best path forward for reducing greenhouse gas emissions? low emission electricity versus low carbon liquid/gas?
I mean, I would argue both, all of the above. I don't think we have one silver bullet technology that's gonna fix everything at this point. I mean, if somebody can come out with a fusion car, that'd be great. But I would argue you kind of need everything sort of to take slices of the pie. But Andrew, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I would probably say the same thing. Uh, yeah, I'm not. It's hard to disagree with that. I mean, you want to move in that direction as quickly as you can. Um, and I don't know that I would just kind of discard any one particular option.
Yeah, I mean, I would. I think. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Jenny.
I was just going to ask, if I don't think you addressed this in your talk, and if you did, I'm sorry if I missed it, but I wondered if how hydrogen fuel cell technology, how that fits into your analysis.
Definitely emerging. I have seen fuel cell cars on the road. Not nearly as widespread right now as your traditional or basic EV or plug-in hybrid, but has a lot of promise. I kind of keep an eye on the market, and I'm not seeing like a ton of investment either. Like no one is talking about a wholesale changeover of the transportation sector to fuel cell. It's all discussion about EVs. But at the same time, that's something I would definitely just keep an eye on in the next 5 to 10 years to see where the fuel cell market goes. And it may be like the next thing after these are more widespread that fuel cell takes off.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think, and to go back to the other sort of question, if you really want to be green, I've always advocated for biodiesel, which if you're green, and by green, I mean green from a climate perspective, not from a emissions coming out of your tailpipe. But there's tons and tons of technical issues with biodiesel. For example, in the winter in Vermont, biodiesel is not a good alternative because it can freeze up. So, I mean, I do think there are some folks in southern states that are avid biodiesel. They drive biodiesel and essentially it's using fuel, old fryer fuels, fryer greases.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to the next question. What's the likelihood that a carbon tax ignites the EV market?
A carbon tax would definitely ignite the EV market. The likelihood of a carbon tax is another question.
0? Maybe 1%?
I don't know. November is not that far away, and so one never knows. But there isn't even, I think, a uniformity within certain political parties about whether a carbon tax is the right way to go. But if there were a political push for a carbon tax, I think that would have a pretty significant potential impact on the EV market, especially if automakers had to pay it and could reduce their tax liability through employment.
I think it depends too on what are they taxing. I mean, people have talked a long time about taxing gas, which would, from an economic perspective, help a lot. But gas prices are so cheap right now that you're really going to need quite a substantial, carbon tax to impact the economics of just burning gas versus an electric car. I mean, gas prices are like $1.99 where I am right now.
I have a question for Brian too, but I don't want to interrupt the flow of questions.
And that's
just, yeah, thanks. The thing that I'm struggling with, Brian, is like, why are the oil companies and oil refineries, on one hand, they're appearing in dockets around the country to like argue against EV infrastructure incentives and EV programs, but on the other hand, they're setting up their EV infrastructure companies. Like Shell has green lots, or BP has an EV infrastructure firm in England. I'm trying to think of another one really recently. What's kind of going on there? Are they on board with this shift in the transportation sector, or are they committed to fighting it? Like, where are they coming out?
Both. I don't think they're on board with the transition. I mean, I don't speak on behalf of all oil companies, but I think you've got a lot of hedging your bets going on. Ideally, obviously, oil companies would like there to be less electric car proliferation, but I think they also see the writing on the wall. And partly, my guess is because of what happened in the renewable fuels program, where a bunch of the refiners essentially got blocked out of being able to get any of the credits. They are probably trying to make sure that doesn't happen again by owning some of the, EV assets. But again, I'm speculating. I'm not sure.
Okay. One more question. You commented that the VW settlement funds were not making a huge impact, that the result was kind of, these little projects that were nibbling around the edges. Why is that? Is it not enough money? Because it seems like an incredible amount of money. So why isn't it making more of a change?
I think it's partly the mission of the settlement and the broad array of projects that are eligible for spending. So if the settlement's goal is ultimately just to reduce NOx emissions, there are lots of ways to do that, and there are lots of spending priorities that can come into play. You can overhaul a bus fleet with more efficient buses that aren't necessarily electric vehicles, and that is something that might be eligible for Volkswagen settlement money. And I think what a lot of states are doing, based on my quick survey of how the money is being spent, is they're just kind of like letting 1,000 flowers bloom, right? They're spreading it out so that you put a little bit here, a little bit there, maybe a little bit on EV infrastructure, maybe a little bit on incentivizing EVs, maybe a little bit on buying new school buses, but not necessarily EV school buses for a school district or a transit fleet. And the net effect may be overall to reduce NOx emissions, but only a portion of that is really changing, creating some sort of fundamental change in the transportation sector.
Got it. Okay. Thank you. I think we need to leave a few minutes for folks to transition to their 1 o'clock classes, so we'll end there. I'll just say that our next Hot Topics will take place on July 16th, and we hope you can join us then. Thanks so much to our speakers, Brian and Andrew, and thanks for everybody for joining us today. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.